Fascist Italy and Mussolini. So, what is fascism? Fascism is a political ideology and mass movement that dominated many parts of Europe between 1919 and 1945. It places an emphasis on nationalism and single-party dictatorship, and Mussolini was one of the first dictators in Europe at the time. So how and why did fascism rise? Well, to start, there was huge economic and social instability after World War One. Savings were wiped out, there was high unemployment, prices had risen 250% since World War One, and strikes had increased because 90% of farmers own less than 3 acres of land. On top of that, there was the Treaty of Versailles, which was introduced in 1919. Italy had been promised the Malta and other territories, but President Wilson, who was the American president at the time, rejected this. There was also fears of communism and the fact that fascism was seen as a barrier against it, and there was the failure of democracy. In 1919, weak coalition parties had been introduced, and they were simply just unable to tackle Italy's economic problems. Then in 1921 came along the Fascist Party with 35 seats. Their members wore black shirts and they were supported by the Catholic Church, and they were funded by AEG or ARI. And they made a significant breakthrough in 1922 when they ended a national strike and restored order to Geneva and Milan. In 1922, there was the March on Rome. Basically, Mussolini said to the king, "Solve these problems or let me solve them." Then 30,000 fascists marched on Rome. The king refused to let the army step in, and eventually the king invited Mussolini to talk and he offered him the position of prime minister. So Mussolini did not fight for power, he was simply offered it by the king. This led to Mussolini's first government, which lasted from 1922 to 1924. All decisions had to receive his approval, and he made the fascist squad legal. Additionally, he passed the Acerbo law. This allowed the party with the largest vote to take two-thirds majority, even if they didn't have two-thirds majority. And by 1924, they had 65% of the votes. This meant they now had the largest amount of votes, and they could take two-thirds majority, meaning they basically had full control. Next came the Aventine succession. Giacomo Matteotti, sorry for the pronunciation, demanded an inquiry into the conduct of the Fascist Party. Within 1 week, he was kidnapped and murdered by the Black Shirts. The public were furious and demanded a resignation of Mussolini. However, instead, the opposition resigned, and this actually saved Mussolini. On top of this, the king did absolutely nothing, and at this point, Mussolini decided it was time to take full control. And in December 1925, he removed the king's right to appoint or dismiss government, and in January 1926, all legislation signed by Mussolini became law. Strict censorship was applied, and private newspapers were banned, and the electorate was reduced from 10 million to 3 million. So overnight, 7 million people lost their right to vote. With his newfound dictatorship set up, he needed a way to keep law and order. So in 1926 he set up the OVRA, which was a parliamentary police force. Political prisoners would be sent to penal settlements in the Lipari Islands, and the OVRA had over 50,000 agents, which were headed by Arturo Bocchino, and over 4,000 were arrested throughout this time. And they also had major success in dealing with the mafia, where over 2,000 mafia members were imprisoned, and they did this by abolishing the juries which the mafia had previously bribed. Now, of course, propaganda was a major characteristic of the fascist regime. Just some background, propaganda is information spread by a political party to influence public opinion, and it's very often false or highly exaggerated. So a ministry of propaganda was established in Italy, and the opposition media were banned. Mussolini was presented as a perfect figure, and he adapted a cult of personality, and he adapted the title of I Deuce. He also adapted many slogans such as work, obey, fight. Education was also highly controlled. Teachers now had to be members of the fascist parties, and textbooks were rewritten, and history was reconstructed. The role of Mussolini in the First World War was also highly exaggerated, and even children's books had cartoon propaganda, such as Mussolini saving the world. On top of this, there was many youth movements to control what the youth were thinking and to brainwash them. If you were ages between 8 to 14, you joined the ONB, where you were trained physically and morally, and the ONB was founded in 1926. At the age of 14, you joined the Avantgarde, and at 18, you joined the Fascist Party, and all other youth organizations were banned, such as Scouts. It's also important to talk about racial laws, and it's also important to know that there was no laws before 1938 targeting any minorities. However, on the 14th of July 1938, the Manifesto on Race was published, and this declared Italians as an Aryan race, and Jews were not an Aryan race. So there was a variety of new laws published, such as foreign-born Jews were no longer allowed in Italy. They were banned from many jobs, such as the civil service and teaching. Jews were no longer allowed in education. Marriage between Jews and non-Jews were no longer allowed. A lot of property was confiscated, and businesses were confiscated too. And it's also important to note that these laws had very little support from the public, and a lot of members of the public actually defended many Jews. And this brings us on to corporate states. These were an alternative between communism and capitalism. Corporations were set up to manage various economic areas such as steel, agricultural, teaching, and so on. And trade unions and strikes were banned. It's also very important to note that these organizations were highly corrupt. So, because of the failing economy in Italy at the time, Mussolini drew up plans for a variety of battles to help stop this. And the first was the Battle for Grain, which was in 1925. And this was based on autarky, which was the belief that Italy should be self-sufficient in the production of food. Grants were given to farmers to grow wheat instead of fruit, but it did not work out very well because of the unsuitable climate, especially in the West, and it resulted in a failure. Then there was the battle for the Lira, and the Lira was the Italian currency. So he wanted the Lira to look stronger, so he revalued and inflated by 10%, and this discouraged foreign countries from buying it. And again, this plan also resulted in a failure. Finally, there was the battle for the Berks. In 1927, Mussolini announced his plan that he wanted 60 million, a population of 60 million by 1950, and this was probably to get more men into the army in case of war. So financial incentives was given to larger families, and a tax was placed on unmarried men. And there's also a lot of discrimination against unmarried men. For example, a married man was much more likely to get a job than an unmarried man. However, it was clear that the birth rates were still declining, and it was deemed a failure by 1938. Finally, this brings us on to his foreign policy. His foreign policy was very simple. He wanted to gain territory and status. He wanted to build a strong army, navy, and air force, and he wanted to use propaganda to convince Europe of Italy's strength. So the first major or notable incident was the Corfu Incident of 1923. Essentially what happened was 5 Italians were killed and Italy demanded compensation from Greece. However, Greece refused to give the compensation. So Italy sent troops and the League of Nations refused to help because Italy threatened to withdraw from the League of Nations if they did help. However, it was later resolved at the Conference of Ambassadors between Italy and Greece ambassadors. Of course, a very important aspect of Italy's foreign policy was its relations with Nazi Germany, which is very interesting. Of course, like everyone else, he felt threatened. He felt threatened by Hitler, especially because of Hitler's plan to unite all German speakers, because Italy had 200,000 German speakers. Then in 1934, Austria's prime minister was murdered by the Nazis, so Italy sent 40,000 troops to keep peace. Hitler was unprepared for war, so he backed off, and then in 1934, Hitler visited Italy to try and improve its relations. This brings us on to the Abyssinian War. This was the turning point in foreign policy because he was no longer peaceful, and he wanted to build a new Roman Empire. So in October 1935, he invaded Abyssinia. Britain and France did not intervene as they were too busy with Hitler's plan to rearm, and the League of Nations did very little. However, they did impose economic sanctions. And then on May 1936, the conquest was complete, and this delighted Italians. However, Italy's reputation was badly damaged, but they did gain the support of Hitler. However, in 1937, they ended up withdrawn because of these economic sanctions that the League of Nations had imposed on them. And finally, there was the two pacts with Germany. The first one was the Rome-Berlin Axis in 1936. This was not a military pact, but it was a formal alliance. And then there was the Pact of Steel in May 1939, which was a military alliance. However, Mussolini did not think war was close. However, when one of Hitler's close companions told him that war was close, he kind of panicked a little bit. However, after the early success of Hitler, Mussolini too entered the war.